Hello everybody, thank you for joining us this evening as we celebrate the launch of Peter Quarry's new book, If I Were You, a psychologist puts himself on the couch. In a nice change up befitting of the title, Peter will be basically in conversation with himself. He's giving a talk rather than the normal panel. Before we commence, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of this land, Jagera and Turrbal people, and traditional owners of the land from which people are zooming in on tonight. I also pay my respects to elders past and present and acknowledge that we are on unceded lands. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we begin. If people would mind if they have their phones turning on to silent, you're of course very welcome to keep them on and to tweet if you wish to do so. We're at Avid Reader 4101. Anybody requiring the toilet, you're welcome to just walk through that gate and head towards the light a few meters down there. There will be a Q&A session towards the end of this session. We ask the author to repeat the question a little bit to the people on Zoom. There will also be a signing after the event, and copies of the book are available at the counter. For our Zoom audience at home, you can ask questions as well using the chat box. We'll also be pasting a link that you can use to purchase a copy of the book online. If you do so during the event, we can also ask the author to sign it for you. And now, for the person of the hour, Peter Quarry is best known as the on-screen psychologist delivering advice on relationship problems, achieving professional success and psychological well-being with what the Boston Business Journal described as great clarity and affability. Having studied at Melbourne University in the mid-1970s, he worked initially as a counsellor of the unemployed, then pivoted to being a sought-after public speaker and workshop facilitator. He co-founded Ash Quarry Productions and became the expert presenter of corporate training videos that, over the following 20 prolific years, gained global recognition. Many are translated into multiple languages and won dozens of international awards. Please make him very welcome.
Thank you very, very much. We have a very intimate group here tonight, but apparently we've got quite a significant Zoom audience, and usually it's the other way around, and no one seems to be able to explain why the Zoom audience tonight is quite large and we're quite intimate, but whatever, we're quite happy. Is it cold?
No, that's why they're at home.
They're at home. Maybe that's the explanation that it's cold. Anyway, welcome to you here and welcome to you watching at Zoom. Socrates famously said that the unexamined life is not worth living. And he'll be very pleased to know that I totally agree with him, because my book is really about how to examine your life and make sense of it. Now, where did this idea come from? Why did I write this book? It was actually the middle of 2019, so the year before the pandemic. And I was thinking about, what do I want to do? And I was reading the work of an American psychotherapist by the name of Victoria Howard. And she wrote about the psychological tasks that are important for people to do when they get to a certain age. And among numerous tasks that she listed, there were two in particular that kind of interested me. That is the idea of doing a life review, examining your life, if you want to use Socrates' language, and then passing on wisdom to those who follow. And for me, those two ideas, the idea of doing a life review and passing on wisdom to those who follow, they kind of made sense. They were two sides of the same coin. So I thought this would be an interesting thing to write about, but I thought, how am I going to do it? I mean, does the world really need another psychology book written by a middle-aged psychologist? Well, possibly beyond middle age, but let's not quibble. And I was thinking, how can I do this? How can I write this book? And all of a sudden, one day, a few days after I was reading Victoria Howard, I came up with this idea, and it just sort of hit me like a flash for what the device was that I can use. And I was so excited, I immediately got up, went to my office, opened my laptop, and I wrote the first 2 pages of the book, which ended up being the introduction. And I would like to read the introduction to you, because that will tell you what the idea is, what the device is that I used for writing this book about how to make sense of your life. The introduction is called Pitching the Idea. I've known Maury, my accountant, for more than 30 years. Recently, I went to visit him in his office to sign my annual tax documents. Pete, you're a smart man, especially for a goy, he started. A goy, by the way, is a non-Jew. I see you've made a lot of share trading this year. You've made some good money. Well done. It's super cool when an accountant praises your financial management skills. By the way, Maury continued, I want to thank you for that advice you gave me. What advice? I replied. Truth is, I'm always giving people advice, giving them my opinion, but I don't usually remember what I've said, especially when they later tell me how useful it was. I told you about how my daughter was planning to marry a non-Jew. I was freaking out. You explained all about catastrophic thinking and how to avoid it. Oh yeah, I remember, vaguely. Well, it worked a treat. I've felt so much better since then, more relaxed about it. I mean, it's not what we ideally want, but Pete, we can live with it. Maury, I'm so glad, and I was. Having been a shrink for nearly 40 years has clearly been a godsend for everyone I know, even my accountant, all that free advice. But it's also been handy for me. Whenever I've had an issue or been unsure what to do, all I needed to do was ask myself for help. I've always found it easy to switch hats and consider my problem from a psychologist's perspective. I just consult PQ, as he's known sometimes affectionately, and ask for his advice. He's never, ever short of it. Now that I'm halfway through my 60s, well into what Jane Fonda called the third and final act of life, I want to ask PQ for assistance again. But this time, I need a different kind of counsel. I don't have a particular problem to solve or resolve. Instead, I've decided to look back and analyse my life. It all flew past so fast. I want to review it to make sense of what happened. I'd be crazy not to seek PQ's help. I also want to see if there is any wisdom about life I can pass on to others. In these chaotic times, the coronavirus pandemic is still raging, people need all the help they can get. Maybe I can provide some. Perhaps there are changes I want to make in my life going forward. So I'm going to write PQ a letter and pitch the idea. I know him pretty well. He'll say yes. He's not as busy as he pretends to be. I'm sure he'll guide me through the journey gently yet firmly. What I don't know is how this joint effort will turn out or what might be uncovered. For me, it will be a supervised exploration into the unknown, maybe murky depths of my life. For you, dear reader, I'd be blissed out if my consultations with PQ inspire you to embark on a similar expedition, because whatever your age, reflecting on your life can yield surprising insights. Finally, I hope these pages trigger your empathy for the challenges I faced, admiration for what I've achieved in spite of myself, and your shock at how naughty I've been along the way. So that was the device that I decided to use. I decided to break myself into these two parts. Pete, which is me, the kind of wild, kind of naughty, drug, sex and rock and roll, had a great time. And PQ, which is also me, but a different part of me, which is this psychologist who's had 40 years experience and won all these awards and blah, 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 blah. And the book is basically a dialogue, a set of letters, a correspondence between the two. What I'd like to do tonight with you, both here in the audience and also those of you watching at home on Zoom, is I'd like to talk to you about how you can reflect on your life. I want to tell you how you can do it, which is what I talk about in the book. And then I also want to talk about the benefits of it, why I think it is a good thing to do, because I really do believe that it is a good thing to do and there are a number of benefits. So let's start by talking about how to do it, how to write your life, how to examine your life. Basically, there are two steps. The first step is you have to write the story of your life. So, you know, this kind of touches on, I guess, what people would call memoir writing. Because if you think of people writing a memoir, they're writing about what's happened in their life, their memories of their life. And it's interesting because you might think that this is only something that older people would do, you know, once you've lived most of your life. It's interesting because actually Prince Harry, I believe, is in the process of writing his memoir. I mean, he's like late 30s, I guess. So he's writing his memoir for the purpose of trying to understand some lessons that he can learn from his life. So I know the idea of writing your life is daunting, but I think it's a really beneficial thing. And I want to read a little bit about some instructions about writing about your life. Now, this is from a letter that PQ writes to Pete, giving instructions about how to write about his life. I believe the best way that you can capture your life in order to examine it more closely is by writing it out like a novel or a film script. That allows you to take a step back and see it more objectively, to be able to view the mountains and the valleys, the deserts and the storms, the glorious sunsets and the plagues. Of course, you could describe your life on video or any other medium instead of writing it out. You could paint it or sculpt it. Maybe it's an acrobatic performance or a piece of music. This is, after all, what artists of all persuasions create. But I believe it is harder to do the reflection and analysis these alternative ways. By having your story written out in front of you in black and white, you can flick backwards and forwards. You can see patterns that were previously invisible and get a better sense of the whole forest rather than just seeing a bunch of trees. I have found the process of writing a life story reveals unexpected insights that you might not easily get other ways. And such revelations can come thick and fast and are, I reckon, always exciting, sometimes electrifying. So, how would you write out the story of your life? Well, I give a very simple technique because I think it can be kind of daunting. So a simple technique of how to do it is by breaking your life down into what I call a series of eras. And I reckon that you should aim, and I describe this in the book, I reckon you should aim between 8 and 12 eras. Now, what is an era? An era might be your 20s. An era might be when you were at university, when you had pink hair, when you lived in a house by the river, when you were in a relationship with Johnny, when you were a heroin addict, when you were living in Timbuktu. It doesn't matter how you define it, as long as it is relevant and real and meaningful to you. So I reckon breaking your life down into a series of eras means that each of the eras can be written up individually, and it's just a little bit easier to do it. Now, if you don't take anything away from tonight, apart from one idea, the one idea that I'd like to suggest to you is later on, tomorrow, when you've got half an hour, when you're on the bus, whenever, take out a piece of paper and actually do this exercise of trying to identify what are the 8 to 12 eras of your life up to where you are now. What would they be? What would you call them? What names would you give them? It's very interesting. I'm looking at some of you going like this, which suggests to me you're already doing, which is great. Don't worry, I won't ask you what they are. But this is a really good way of breaking your life down into manageable chunks. And then what you do is you actually write out each era in terms of what happened. So that's the first part of how to do a life review, of how to examine your life. The second part, which I think is very interesting, is to then unpack it, to make sense of it. And where I'm coming from here is we know from psychological research that writing about your life, writing about your past can be very healing, particularly if you've had trauma in your past. There's been a lot of research that shows that writing about what happened back then can reduce symptoms of anxiety, depression, and so on. So it's a really healing thing to do, to write about your past. For a long time, they didn't know why this was such a beneficial thing. And there were theories like, oh, well, you know, it's really a cathartic experience when you write about your past. In fact, they discovered what does seem to help most. And this is because they looked at who got helped most by writing about their past. And it seems that people who benefited most from writing about their past were people who tend to use the following expressions. It now makes sense to me that, or when I look back at this era, I now realize this about myself. Or joining the dots, I now have come to understand blah, blah, blah. In other words, what seems to be associated with the maximum benefit of writing about your life is not when you just describe what happens. I mean, that's important, but when you take it an extra step and you start processing it, you start unpacking it, you start making sense of it, you start analysing it, you start exploring it and making the connections. That's what really, really tends to be very beneficial. So how do you do that? How do you actually unpack your life? Well, the basic way you do it is by asking questions. And there are two types of questions that you can ask. One are questions that really relate to any era of your life. And they're questions like, well, what was happening then? How do you feel about it? What was working? What wasn't working? What did you understand about yourself? What did you learn about yourself from this era? What could you have done differently if you had your time again? So these are questions that you can really ask of any era of your life, your teens, middle years, even later years. And they can be very, very useful. But I think to really unpack your life, to really kind of get down into the nitty-gritty, there is another level of questions. And this is what I try to cover in the book. And these are questions that are informed by various psychological theories and data sets and practices. Let me give you a couple of examples, because I know this can sound a little bit theoretical. I reckon one of the, let me just have a sip of water. I reckon one of the big issues in life is falling in love. I'm seeing a few smiles. You know, you don't want to go there? Okay. It's falling in love. Now, a really interesting question is, why do we fall in love with the people we fall in love with? A variation on that question is, why do we keep falling in love with the same wrong person? But why do we fall in love? Now, there's a very interesting theory, psychological theory developed by a guy called Harville Hendricks. I don't know if you've heard of him. He's an American psychologist. He came up with a particular theory, which I think can help to analyse why we fall in love with certain sorts of people. Now, I'd like to actually read you a small segment. Just hang on, let me just find it. Page 170. You can see I prepared a kind of a number of things to read out. So this is from a letter from PQ to Pete, where PQ is helping Pete explore this particular issue about why he's fallen in love with certain people. There is an interesting explanation for romantic attraction called Imago Theory. Developed by psychologist Harville Hendricks, it says that most of us have some unresolved damage or wound from youth or childhood. It is something that we couldn't fix back then because we were young and powerless. And we seek to symbolically resolve this issue later in life by choosing a particular type of person to fall in love with. Our love interest represents an opportunity to work on our issue, to try and fix it in a way that we weren't able to when we were younger. Let me give you an example to illustrate what this means. This is a true story. I know a woman, she's in her early 60s now. She was married to the father of her children for, 25, 30 years, and they split up, I think, when she was about 50. In her early 50s, she fell in love with this guy. Now, this particular guy had never lived with a woman before. He had many relationships, but never actually lived with a woman, with a partner. And about a year into their relationship, he moved in with her. They had a very successful relationship. They got along very, very well. He was a lovely man. They traveled together, they entertained together, they had a great sex life, apparently. So it was a really wonderful relationship, and it went on for nearly 10 years. But this woman had a particular problem with him, and that was that he never committed to buying a house with her. She wanted to buy a house with him, and she felt that this would be a commitment, a sign of commitment. And I remember saying to her, he's very committed, he just doesn't want to buy a house with you. It doesn't mean that he's not committed, but no, in her mind, commitment equals buying a house together. And anyway, she got more and more angry as the years went on, and she started nagging him about this idea of buying a house together. And for one reason or another, he didn't want to do it. His father hadn't died and he was going to inherit some money, and there were all sorts of reasons. Anyway, the situation got worse and worse and worse and worse, and she finally ended the relationship with a huge fight, saying that you're not committed, even though they had been together for about 8 or 9 years. They'd been living together for about 6 or 7 years, and they were in a wonderful monogamous relationship. And she really ended the relationship, which I thought was a big mistake. Okay, cut to a couple of years later, she read my book, and she phoned me, and she said, I've had this incredible insight. I said, what? And she said, I remember now when I was about 18 or 19, I was in love with this guy. He was my first big love. And he and I had planned to buy a place together, and we were going to move in together and live happily ever after. And for some reason, out of the blue, he just left me. Now, you don't have to be a psychologist to join the dots. She carried with her all of those years this idea that buying a house equals commitment. That's where it came from. And that any guy who doesn't want to commit is bad news. And she carried this idea with her. She fell in love with this later guy who had never lived with anyone, who'd never bought a house with anyone, and she was going to fix that situation. She was going to resolve that unsatisfied urge that she had. And that's why she got into the relationship. And unfortunately, that's why she ended up sabotaging the relationship and ending what I think was a very good relationship. So I think the idea of thinking back on why you fall in love with people can really help you understand what happens in your life. I mean, I know for me, I've always tended to fall in love with people who need to be rescued. I had a mother who had lots of trouble, was very, very passive. My father died when I was very young, and she needed a man in her life to tell her what to do, and I was it. And so I've been a rescuer all my life, and it's no coincidence that I'm a psychologist. So that's one example of the sort of questions that you can ask to explore your life in more detail. Another example of the sort of questions that come from some sort of psychological practice is often people in their middle years, particularly their 40s, tend to get very restless. And some of us talk about midlife crisis. And a midlife crisis is in many ways, you're looking at your life right now and you're comparing it to the life that you thought you'd have when you're in your 20s, seeing whether they actually match up or not. And very often they don't match up. I had an awful midlife crisis in my 40s. And it was weird because I was very successful. I was making lots of money. I had a very lucrative career. I had a company that was making corporate training videos, which, as you said in your introduction, we distributed in 20 countries around the world. I mean, NASA used to use my videos. I was on TV at the time. I was on Good Morning Australia with Bert Newton, who some of you may remember. I was a psychologist. So, you know, I was after fame and fortune, and I had it. I had them both. But somehow I felt very empty inside. You know, I wasn't really fulfilled. And what I realized looking back on that era now is that I hadn't really identified a life purpose. What is a life purpose? Well, let me read you a little bit about life purpose. Once again, this is from a letter from PQ to Pete, where he's helping Pete to think through what happened in his 40s, think through about why he was feeling so flat and why he just couldn't seem to get out of this midlife funk. The writer, Charles Handley, argued that each of us has a special talent, which he called a golden seed. Sometimes you know it yourself, other times you might need others to point it out to you. In fact, Handy suggested that if you are unsure, try asking a dozen people you know to list the one thing that you are really good at and look for the trend. However you discovered it, your golden seed needs to be developed, used, leveraged, expressed. Finding a way of doing it is a critical part of your life's purpose. Handy described these two elements as doing the best you can with what you are best at. Now, having a particular skill set and using it fully are two critical parts of a life purpose. But there is a third essential ingredient, and it's the why. What's the reason for doing the best you can with what you are best at? Research shows that people who assist others, who behave altruistically, are happier than those who do not. Buddhism, of course, teaches the same edict. So for a life purpose to be potent, it needs to include some element of contributing, serving, or giving to others. As Timothy Wilson says, one of the best ways to achieve a sense of purpose is to find an activity in which you are helping others. So, Pete, back to your midlife era. Why couldn't you climb out of the hole you were in? Simple. Your purpose back then had only two of the three essential components. Yes, you had identified your golden seed, and yes, you did use them, but your motivation was about achieving fame and fortune. Helping others wasn't your raison d'etre, your reason for being. Your motivation is what needed to shift for you to find a new satisfying way forward. It would be a small but significant change of focus to act in the service of others rather than in your own self-interest. To quote Gail Sheehy, if we have confronted ourselves in the middle passage and found a renewal of purpose around which we are eager to build a more authentic life structure, these may well be the best years. So for me, when I thought back about those middle years, my 40s, where I was feeling very empty, I came to realize that I had not actually identified life purpose with those three elements. And that was really very, very beneficial for me. I mean, I feel ashamed to admit that I hadn't realized that back then, but that's the way it is. At least I finally realized it. Okay, let's change focus and talk a bit about, I've talked a little bit about how to do a life review, that you write out the story of your life, and then you interrogate it, you ask questions. Let's talk about what are the benefits that you can get from doing so, because I think there are three really amazing benefits. And that's why I'm here talking about this, because I want to try and get this message across. The first benefit I think that you can achieve is to make peace with the past. Now, I had a horrific childhood. My father died when I was 3. My mother was German, and she had lived through World War II in Germany with the bombs dropping for 6 years. I mean, think Ukraine and multiplied by 6 years. She came out to Australia to marry my father, and when my father died, she was left here in Australia with 2 kids. And she really didn't feel at point in here. And so she decided to go back to Europe. And so we hopped on a boat and went back to Europe. And after a couple of months there, she thought, no, this was a mistake. Really, we should be in Australia. The boys speak English. What are we doing in June? So we hopped on a boat and came back. Now, in those days, you could fly, but she loved boat travel because for 4 to 6 weeks, she could suspend reality. She didn't have to worry about anything. She could just be, you know, in this sort of make-believe world where you just got dressed up every night, you went off for dinner, and other people worried about all the sort of mechanics of life. It was pretty horrible for me because we went back to Europe, we came back to Australia, no, she didn't like it here, we went back there, and we ended up spending pretty well all of my childhood going backwards and forwards between Europe and Australia. Every time we did one of these trips, it was like, oh, we're going to go back to Europe, Australia, and then we're going to be home. We're going to establish a home. And it never happened. My childhood was also pretty horrible because my mother really needed a companion, and I was the companion, even though I was a child. For example, when I was, 8 or 9 on the boats going backwards and forwards, most of the children used to eat in the children's dining room. Well, my mother insisted that I accompany her to dinner with the adults. So as an 8-year-old, I had a tuxedo with a little bow tie, and I had to sort of accompany my mother to dinner, and I'd sit on this table with all these adults, it was all silver service, and I had my own little wine glass filled with milk. After dinner, I would accompany my mother to the lounge where there'd be one of those little bands playing, and my mother taught me how to go up to any single ladies, bow, ask them to dance, accompany them to the dance, dance a little bit, take them back to their seat, let them sit, bow again and withdraw. I mean, it was crazy. My mother was also borderline inappropriate in terms of some of her parenting behaviours. For example, she insisted that I sleep with her when I was 13 in the same bed. Not a great idea. So for a long time, I think you can understand, I felt pretty angry about the childhood that I'd had. I mean, I go into obviously a lot more detail. I felt, why me? Why did my father have to do it? Why did I have the loony mother? Why couldn't I have had a normal family upbringing with a mother and a father and a house in the suburbs with a Holden in the garage? I craved the typical suburban normality, but unfortunately it was not to be. When I wrote about this era, one of the things that PQ did was he said, is there another way that you can look at this? Is there a way in which you can make peace with your past? Get over the anger that you felt all of your life about what happened to you in childhood. And what I'd like to do is actually read to you a little bit about what PQ suggests. Just bear with me. So this is a letter from PQ to Pete, helping Pete make sense of, understand, unpack, make peace with his past. There is a form of psychotherapy called narrative therapy. Simply put, it suggests that we all have stories we create and tell ourselves about our lives. And these stories influence the way we feel about ourselves, as well as the lives we are living or have led. The therapy involves identifying which of those stories are helpful and which are not, and if necessary, editing or rewriting them so as to achieve better therapeutic outcomes. The core premise behind narrative therapy is that our perceptions of the world and our place in it are subjective. We interpret life events in order to make sense of them, but often these interpretations, stories, are biased or distorted. At the very least, some ways of looking at our lives make us feel and function better than others. Let's apply this idea to you, Pete. In telling your life story so far, the description is quite negative. You paint yourself as unhappy and stuck in a situation that you didn't like. You were angry and frustrated. You dreamt about an alternative existence, a normal life. In the main, you still feel bad about the experiences you described. Now, I'm not saying you weren't justifiably unhappy or that your reactions to your circumstances weren't completely reasonable and logical. That's not the point. I wonder how you'd feel about your childhood if you changed the story you tell about it and put more of an emphasis on the positives that come out of it. In your letter, you do suggest that there was a positive side to your childhood, and this is precisely the direction I'm encouraging you to consider. But I want you to take it further than you already have. How would you feel if you framed the story to focus on what benefits you gained from your unconventional childhood circumstances? Let me suggest a few. You saw more of the world at a very young age than most people see in a lifetime. You were exposed to all sorts of people and situations, even asking old ladies to dance, which developed a range of social skills and attitudes that allow you to fit in virtually anywhere. You developed notable resilience, which we did briefly touch on earlier. You learned how to cope. And I think it's important for you to realize that your tough times toughened you up. You learned a range of vital life skills, such as how to solve problems and plan solutions. And critically, you gained an early aptitude in financial management that most people don't have. Your childhood gave you the drive not to repeat your mother's mistakes and instead create what you rate as a wonderful, fulfilled life. How did you go about achieving that, if not at least partially as a result of your childhood development? My point is that looking at your early life through this prism, your unquestionably challenging childhood gave you the opportunity to gain a range of skills, knowledge, and experience that set you up for the pretty fab life you seem to have. Sigmund Freud said, one day, in retrospect, the years of struggle will strike you as the most beautiful. I have to say, doing that piece of work, changing the way I viewed my childhood, makes me now look at my childhood and feel grateful for it and feel happy that I've had it for what it gave me rather than feeling angry about it. And this is something that's only happened in the last few years, amazing. So one of the benefits, one of the amazing benefits of doing a life review is it does allow you the opportunity to make peace with your past. A second benefit, I'm just going to check the time. I think we're doing okay. Yes. A second benefit is it allows you to increase your self-awareness. When you examine your life, when you write about your life, when you look at it, when you think about it, it allows you to understand yourself better. And there is a mountain of research that shows very clearly that increasing your self-knowledge, increasing your self-awareness, increasing your self-understanding leads to very good outcomes. You're more successful at school, you're better at uni, you make more money, you have more successful relationships, and so on. I mean, a whole bunch of things. I learned from doing this exercise that I am a pessimist. But I'm a particular type of pessimist, and I'll very, very quickly read to you the type of pessimist I am. The psychologist Martin Seligman wrote a fabulous book in which he explored the idea of explanatory styles to describe the way optimists and pessimists typically view and explain things. For example, if something bad happens, a pessimist will tend to think that it will continue forever, which it probably won't. This type of faulty thinking is called inaccurate forecasting. An optimist, on the other hand, will assume the bad thing represents a temporary situation that will pass. I came to realize doing this exercise that I suffer from inaccurate forecasting. I always think that bad things are going to happen. But what was really interesting is I realized that actually this manifests itself in a number of ways. For example, in my late 30s, I split up from a very long-term relationship, and I went through a really bad funk for a couple of years, it wasn't because of the relationship split up. It's because I really genuinely thought I was never going to meet anyone again, which of course was ridiculous and stupid. But it was an example of inaccurate forecasting. But I've realized as a result of doing this exercise that this manifests in other ways as well. For example, I'm a shocking hypochondriac. I was walking down the street the other day and I felt this twinge in my hip and I thought, I've got to have hip replacement therapy. I mean, as soon as I feel any symptom, I immediately think the worst, inaccurate forecast. I also realize that it impacts on the way I invest money. You know how when you invest, you always have to do that test to see how risk adverse you are. Well, I'm always down the kind of super risk adverse end of the spectrum because I always think there's going to be a crash. Well, there is a little bit of a crash happening now, but I've been predicting it for 10 years. So I realized, I came to understand that I'm a shocking pessimist, and it was a very interesting revelation for me. There are other things that you can understand about yourself that you can discover, but the second benefit is this idea of increased self-awareness. Very quickly, the final and third benefit from doing a life review is it allows you to plan and think about what you want to do with the time you have left, which may be a lot of time or it may be not so much time. And the things that you might want to change can be the obvious things like, I want to get fitter, or I want to give up the fags, or I want to stop drinking, or I want to, what have you. Or they can be more subtle things like, I want to change the way I think. I know for me, when I turned 60, I'm 67 now, when I turned 60, I hated it because I thought, oh my God, I'm going through the doors of old age. We live in a very ageist society, and it's very hard not to take those messages on board. As a result of doing this work, I've realized that I've got a whole bunch of skills, coping skills. I've coped with all sorts of things in the past. I'll be able to cope with whatever life throws up at me. So I actually feel a lot more confident about the future. And the thing that I want to do going forward, which I identified in the book, is I want to not worry about being old, not be scared about it, and actually be confident that I can handle whatever happens. So 3 benefits of doing a life review: making peace with the past, getting to know yourself better, and being able to plan what you want to do differently going forward. And I think they're 3 pretty amazing benefits. I think I'll probably end at this stage talking about the book, and let's take some questions from both you and I think from those of you who are watching Zoom, and I know somebody is going to look at the questions that you've sent, but maybe some of you might have a question that you want to ask. Yes.
Okay, I'll be the first.
Thank you very much.
So Peter, is there a philosopher that's influenced you a lot in your life, and in your thinking and your healing and your?
Yes. Look, probably the main philosopher was a French philosopher by the name of Jean-Paul Sartre.
Yes.
And he was a member of the existentialist school of philosophy. And very, very simply, his argument was that we are the creators of our own life. And we have a responsibility to create our own life. When I first came across this, when I was at university, I studied philosophy at uni. It was like, yes, this makes so much sense to me. So, it's interesting because there's a psychologist by the name of Rotter who came up with this idea of the internal-external control scale. The idea that some people feel that the control over their lives is very much internal to them, i.e. I control my life, whereas other people feel that the control over their lives is out there. It's God or my genes or my parents that really determine what happens in my life. I believe it's a good thing to be highly internal, to feel that you're in control, and that for me, marries up psychology with that particular existential philosophy. So Jean-Paul Sartre, really life-changing for me. Well, great question, thank you. Any other questions? Yes.
It's been often said that blessed are the pessimists, for they are never disappointed. So isn't that the positive
Well-
side of being a pessimist?
Well, I'm going to respond to your question a different way. They've done some research which has looked at optimists and pessimists, and pessimists are more in touch with the reality.
Yeah.
Which is maybe another way of saying the same thing that you're saying. So, look, you know, I think it's better to be an optimist. You know, chances are you're going to be healthier. But you know, optimists are more in touch with the reality. But good question.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And I'm curious to know how PQ would understand.
Sorry, I realise that I haven't actually been repeating the questions. My apology. The second question was,
I mean, as a psychologist,
how would PQ understand
your mother,
his mother?
what's the diagnosis?
Well, my father met her before the war in Germany. He actually worked for General Motors and was sent over there to work for Opel, and he met my mother and they had a little affair. And then he came back to Australia, and she stayed in Germany for the war, the duration of the war. And after the war, he tried to find her. It took him 2 years to find her, and he eventually found out that she was alive and living in Germany. And he sent her a telegram and said, I want to marry you, come to Australia. So in 1947, she came to Australia. She had to go via America and be processed by the United States Bureau of Denazification to prove that she wasn't a Nazi. And she came to Australia. Now, to answer your question, how would I make sense of it? I think she was suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. You know, 6 years of war plus 2 years of, you know, awful deprivation because there was no food or anything. And then when she came to Australia, she had a very hard time fitting in, and she was the enemy. You know, and in those days, Australia wasn't really super welcoming of foreigners. So, you know, I think she had a very, very hard time. So that's the sort of diagnosis that PQ would have. But Pete and PQ have sort of conflicting feelings about her. I mean, on the one hand, I feel very sorry for her. On the other hand, I feel, you know, not happy about a lot of the parenting techniques that she used. So it was complex. But yes, that would be the diagnosis.
But it's interesting, all the great philosophers and psychologists were German.
Yeah.
You were plugged right into that
I'm half German.
pessimist
Thank you.
point of view.
Any other questions? Are there any questions from?
There are. It was more of a comment. There's a couple of inquiries about, can I really get the book signed by you? So you've been answering
Okay.
that.
Yes, you can
There's
get the
another
book signed
comment
by me.
that's so nice. I thought we could close with it.
Okay.
If people wanted to have more questions, so it's just a comment.
So just a comment. Okay. Any other questions from you? Go for it, and you can ask a second one if you want to.
Okay.
Thank you. Go for it. Go for it.
So have you ever worked with anyone whom you couldn't help, Peter? So whether that be suffering anxiety or something you couldn't help?
Great question. The question is, when I worked as a psychologist, did I ever work with a client who I couldn't help? Yes. And it's a very hard lesson to learn as a psychologist or in any of the helping professions, that you can't help everyone. It's, you know, you come out of psychology school and you think, I'm going to change the world, I'm going to help everyone, and it just doesn't work like that. It's really, really tough. You know, you can take a horse to water, but you can't make it drink, basically. And there's a concept in both education and helping, and that is the concept of readiness to change. And you can only really help somebody when they are ready to be helped and ready to change. And that may not necessarily be when you see them. When I first started working as a psychologist, I get a lot of clients referred to me from other agencies, and these clients would kind of be forced to see the psychologist. And it was very, very hard because they would come and they would sit there. That was it. So you had to kind of develop a whole bunch of strategies to try and see whether you could work around them. But no, to answer your question, no, you can't help everyone, and it's a tough lesson to learn. Good question, great question.
We have had a couple coming now.
All right, okay.
How do you reconcile the wounded child within compared to the academic interpretation of your life?
How do I reconcile the wounded child within with the academic
Interpretation of your
interpretation? somehow it happened, and I don't know that I can explain. I mean, the idea of looking at my life from these two perspectives, PQ, the psychologist, and Pete, the kind of protagonist, if you were, it just felt very, very comfortable. And, you know, by letting these two have a conversation, have a dialogue, it seemed to just resolve it. I don't know that I can answer that question any better than that.
Then there's, how do you overcome writing in the first and second person any hugely emotional, traumatic moments where it was too painful to write?
So how did I
Overcome
writing in the first? Well, I know that both Pete and PQ write in the first person. And it was very easy to flip-flop between the two. I mean, when I studied as a psychologist, we used, back in the 70s, we used to use this technique called the two-chair technique. So let's say you came to me and, you know, you weren't sure whether you wanted to leave your job or not. I'd set up two chairs and I'd say, when you're sitting in that chair, you're the part of you that wants to leave. When you're in that chair, you're the part of you that wants to stay. Let's have a conversation between the two. Great technique. So in a sense, I kind of borrowed that technique. And at any one time, it was just a matter of responding to the last letter from the different point of view. It was actually very easy. Okay, maybe a final question, or do you want to go straight to the comment?
Oh, there's a question there?
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry.
How does PQ advise Pete about getting out and not worry about it? That's possibly free advice from you.
Yeah, well, sure. By realizing that by getting Pete to realize how much difficulty he's coped with in his life already. I mean, it's as obvious as that. But by getting him to actually think about that he's coped with blah and blah and blah and blah and blah, and why shouldn't he therefore be able to cope with the same things? The other thing is to get him to realize ageism and to get him to realize internalized ageism. I mean, we often talk about internalized homophobia, but we all take on board the mores and norms of the society within which we live. And we live in a very ageist society, and we take that on board. So recognizing that and sort of being aware of that can help you to sort of dispel it. So really through those two things. But I think there was one last question.
And it's a follow-up from the lady in the front, where you were talking about that excellent questions about the people that you don't help, and the concept of readiness. Yes, teacher here. I know as a teacher that building a relationship with children does sort of help kids get to that point often.
Yeah.
Does the same kind of thing happen in your world in psychology?
So the question is, working with somebody who maybe doesn't want to change, is establishing a relationship an important precursor to being able to do that? And the answer is absolutely.
And how do you go about it?
By listening. By establishing rapport, which I'm hopefully doing with you right now.
Yes.
You know, and things like eye contact and listening. But by listening to people's story, I mean, I was down in Hobart just the other week doing a similar gig down there at a bookshop down there. And I was telling somebody about the last time I'd been in Hobart, which was like 20 years ago. I was hired to work with some people coming off the night shift at the aluminium smelter. And they hired me because they wanted to introduce a performance appraisal scheme where the bosses sat down with workers and gave them feedback about their performance. And they knew that this would be a hard sell. And so the way I started the session was, instead of going and saying, hey, this is going to be great for you, blah, blah, I actually asked them the question, tell me about your bosses. What sort of boss do you like? What sort of boss don't you like? And what's your actual boss like? I started to listen to them. And from there, I kind of then, so it's about listening. It's about understanding the other person, showing empathy, showing respect also for whatever their lived experience is. That doesn't guarantee that you can, you know, change them, but it does at least move you towards that space. Thanks, great question. Do we want to end with?
Sure.
you've got some comment.
Do you have anything else you wanted to say?
I just wanted to say thank you so much for coming tonight and for your questions, and also for those of you watching from Zoom. And thank you to Avid and to Jackie in particular for organising.
Thank you. So this is a concluding comment from Zoom, which is, dear Avid, hello, I'm finding this absolutely fantastic. I've been thinking about writing memoir and all of a sudden the world is talking to me about it from here, there and everywhere. Thank you. So yeah, so it was very nice to have done. Anybody else that does have any questions, might I recommend that you ask them at the signing table. Peter is available. And please thank him all for coming and giving us such a lovely night tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you. What were some of the other comments that came in?
Oh, it was mostly people asking how they can get.
Oh, okay, so
get a book.
some
Yeah,
mechanical
yeah.
matters. Oh, okay.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Isn't that
So,
weird?
yeah.
Isn't that weird?